Welcome back to the Acadian question, where the history of Prince Edward Island isn't just stories in dusty old textbooks, it's a living conversation. My name is Kristina.
And my name is Michael.
In this episode of the Acadian question, we will be looking more closely at the 1752 census, discussing Micmac Acadian relations and the events leading up to the expulsion through an analysis of the Gallant family in conversation with the 1752 Rivière du Nord-Est census to demonstrate what life was like for Acadians during this time marked by struggle and growing uncertainty about security in Ile St.
Lots to talk about today. We're also going to have our friend Keianna join us to specifically talk about the other residents of the island, most notably the Mi'kmaq, whose presence on Ile St. Jean preceded that of the European settlers. Alright, let's get started. In the last episode, we discussed with Lauren the patriarch of the Gallant family, Michel Hache Gallant, his beginnings in Acadia, his family, and the legacy he left behind. We also discussed the Gallants' migration from Beaubassin to Port-le-Joie before settling in Rivière du Nord-Est.
There's so much to go over, but I think we should start with what we know about the Gallants' migration into Rivière du Nord-Est. I have a feeling that it's an interesting story that will reveal a lot about life on Ile St. Jean.
We know that by 1730, a plot of land was owned by François Hache Gallant near what would become Rivière du Nord-Est. Though it is unknown if he was living there, having been 23 years old and unmarried at the time of the map's creation, François was listed under his father's household in the 1734 census of Port-le-Joie 4 years later. His wedding similarly taking place in Port-le-Joie the following year, a triple wedding that saw him, his brother Jacques, his sister Louise married on the same day. So François' mention on that map might be incorrect, but it is however likely that someone in the family either was living on or continued to own that plot of land situated on the south side of the Rivière du Nord-Est, as the 1752 census notes the family living in that approximate area as having acquired it from Charles Hache, as guardian and curator of the children of the late René Resquiot. Charles and François' sister Marie had been the children's mother, and both she and her husband had passed away by the 1752 census.
So when can we say exactly that the Gallants migrated to Rivière du Nord-Est?
Based on the census, it is quite likely that the growing Hache Gallants found themselves in Rivière du Nord-Est after 1734, and the question of why the family left Port-le-Joie sheds light on the environmental and political factors affecting Ile St. Jean in this period.
Do you mind telling us how the Gallants' migration to Rivière du Nord-Est is indicative of the environmental and political factors of this time?
Well, in the early 18th century, Ile St. Jean was significantly affected by mouse plagues.
That sounds like a bad movie. Do you mean mice were spreading disease, or were mice dying in large numbers?
Neither, Kristina. Mice were destroying a significant amount of crops in Ile St. Jean. I was reading D.C. Harvey's 1926, The French Regime in Prince Edward Island, and discovered that a particularly destructive mouse plague in 1738 forced officials to send provisions from Ile Royale to Ile St. Jean to prevent starvation. The book stated that, quote, the crops of 1738 were coming on beautifully, when without warning a plague of field mice advanced upon the grain, sparing not even the grass. All was but a repetition of the calamity of 1728. However, the shipment of provisions could not adequately stop the starvation of many colonists, likely forcing many to migrate.
So you think that the Gallants moved further down the river to Rivière du Nord-Est to find a new area not affected by the mouse plague?
Possibly, but we can't say for sure. There were also political factors that compelled many of Port-le-Joie's residents, including many of the Gallants, to migrate.
And what were these political factors? And how do we know that this would have affected the Gallant family specifically?
So in 1744, war had broken out between the French and the British as part of the War of Austrian Succession taking place in Europe. I can't imagine what it would have felt like for the residents of Port-le-Joie as a British detachment was sent to Ile St. Jean not long after.
We can assume that a great feeling of anxiety was spreading through Port-le-Joie. I mean, if Louisbourg fell, who's to say the same wouldn't happen to the smaller Port-le-Joie?
I think it was clear to the residents of Port-le-Joie that the time to leave was now or never.
That makes a lot of sense when you look at the dates given for certain land grants in Larocque's 1752 census. Looking at the Gallant specifically, siblings François, Charles, and Anne all have land grants dating to early July of 1745. When did the British arrive in Port-le-Joie? Is it possible that the Gallants and others like them fled early in anticipation?
Port-le-Joie was taken by the British and burned down, including the Gallant family home. by July 11th of that year, a mere 10 days after the land grants were authorized to the Gallants.
Wow. So this was a population actively fleeing British encroachment.
Right. I think the proximity and dates from the authorization of the land grants with the capture of Port-le-Joie indicates the people of Rivière du Nord-Est, including the Gallants, who were not just migrants but refugees. The mass migration of internally displaced Acadians was not unique to the community of Rivière du Nord-Est, but was happening all across Ile St. The same anxiety that caused the Gallants to move further along the river in 1745 saw a massive increase in Rivière du Nord-Est population in the late 1740s and early 1750s.
Really? How so?
Well, out of the 45 households listed on the census of Rivière du Nord-Est, 24 of them only moved to the settlement in the last 4 years.
Wow. Where did they come from?
All of them came from Acadia or were married to Acadian women. It seems like growing anxieties of the British caused many to leave. It couldn't have been easy to leave their land. Kristina, could we look at the 1752 census? I think it would help demonstrate the economic situation of the community, since it describes the material items of each household in Rivière du Nord-Est.
Sure. I have the census pulled up right here. Okay, so in the 1752 census, there were 7 heads of household listed as part of the Hache Gallant family, all direct descendants of Michel Hache Gallant. The households are all distributed relatively evenly between the north and south side of the river, with 5 of the 7 Gallant households originally hailing from Acadie, with the exception of Francois Hache Gallant from Louisbourg and Charles Hache de Charlie, who is from Port-le-Joie. But that makes sense. Both were sons of Jean-Baptiste Gallant, who had followed his father Michael to Port-le-Joie a few decades earlier, and who had passed away by 1752. Like many of the other Acadian families on the census, the Hache Gallants have very large families with several children. Between the 7 families listed, there are 24 children. The most affluent of the Hache Gallants appear to be the families of Pierre Hache Gallant and Charles Hache Gallant, 2 of the leading ploughmen, or farmers, in Rivière du Nord-Est.
Oh, wow, so the Gallants were thriving in Rivière du Nord-Est even after they were forced to flee Port-le-Joie?
I don't know if I'd say thriving, per se. In terms of a small settlement, then yes, they were definitely comfortable. But serious, substantial wealth is another story. We can get a glimpse into the levels of prosperity that were achievable in this period by turning to the 1751 report of Colonel Franquet, who spent a period of his time on the island in the Rivière du Nord-Est settlement. According to D.C. Harvey, Franquet was sent to examine Ile Royale and Ile St. to devise a system of defense for France's possessions in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. While in Rivière du Nord-Est, he spent his time visiting the very affluent Nicolas Gautier, who, according to historian Bernard Potier, was an exceptionally wealthy Acadian. Gautier and his family fled Annapolis Royal and settled at Rivière du Nord-Est in 1749, and upon surveying the Gautiers' relatively new property, Franquet comments that hopefully he may be able to generate some compensation for all that the Gautiers had lost leaving Acadia.
Well, was he able to find success in Rivière du Nord-Est?
Nicolas Gautier passed away between Franquet's visit and Sieur de la Roque's census, though his widow does appear. They're certainly doing well, as his widow Marie-Elaine possesses 18 heads of cattle, 4 sheep, 80 fowl, and 7 arpents by 40 of land. They're doing better, slightly, than our most affluent Hache Gallants, to some degree, though it is a far cry from the prosperity that the Gautiers knew less than a decade before.
Wow, it's crazy how things can change so quickly.
Tell me about it. And there's actually another really interesting clue we can gather from Colonel Franquet's 1751 survey when it comes to changing circumstances. From looking at the census, we can gather that economic affluence was also a very gendered experience. Widowed women such as Marie Genty, the sister-in-law to the Gallant siblings through her marriage to Jean-Baptiste Gallant, often suffered disproportionately. She, like other widowed Acadian women, were often economically destitute, and in 1752, Sieur de la Roque described her economic status as, quote, very poor, end quote. The family was only able to sow 7 bushels of wheat, despite clearing land for 32 bushels, owing to their poverty. What I find so interesting, though, is that we actually meet Marie in Franquet's journey the year before, which is something I didn't notice initially due to a mistranslation.
What do you mean?
Well, during Colonel Franquet's time in Rivière du Nord-Est, he stayed with a woman known as the, quote, widow gentille, end quote, who was known by all to frequently house travelers on the island. In his time at the widow Gentil's home, Franquette stops to admire the luxuriant fields of grain around her residence. These luxuriant fields, and her history of hospitality, suggests that the widow Gentil certainly has the means to support herself and visitors. Now, what if I told you that the widow Gentil who welcomed Colonel Franquette in 1751 is the same destitute Marie Gentil from the 1752 census?
What do you mean by that?
Of course, her surname is spelt differently by Larocque, though the differentiation suggests that Larocque spelt her name phonetically, ending in a Y rather than the proper IL used by Franquette. It seems coincidental, though Franquette mentions a beautiful spring by the home of the widow Gentil, known as Le Grand Source. Looking at the census, our poor Marie Gentil's land is practically bordered on each side by two of her elder sons, one of whom is settled, according to Larocque, directly at Le Grand Source.
Wow, I never noticed that. What do you think could have caused her circumstances to change so quickly?
It's difficult to know for sure, but looking at the number of children she had to support against their lower number of livestock is certainly an indication. In a single-income household, having to raise 7 children in a time of great uncertainty as a woman would certainly be a difficult task. Acadian families often had many children, and the women often married and had children at a young age, causing a great surge in the Acadian population in Ile St. during the 18th century. In fact, Marie Gentil had the first of her many Hache Gallant children at the age of 16.
Do you think that the surge in the Acadian population had any societal or environmental effects in Ile St. Jean?
That's a good question. Environmentally, larger Acadian families were able to cultivate more land around the marshlands of Ile St. Jean. However, this larger population of Acadian families migrating further into the interior of Ile St. Jean likely had an effect on the local indigenous population of the island. As the Acadian population increasingly grew, so did the demand for resources. There's a chance that this demand created competition between Acadians and the Micmac, the local indigenous group on Ile St. Jean, which might have led to a slight deterioration of Acadian-Micmac relations, as the Micmac were driven off their traditional fishing and hunting lands, as had been seen on mainland Acadia, according to William Wiccan.
So what was the relationship like between the Acadians and the Micmac in Rivière du Nord-Est?
I think that's a perfect segue to introduce our friend Keianna, who's here to talk to us about her research on Acadian-Micmac relations in Ile St. Jean. Hi, Keianna.
Hi guys, I'm so happy to be here.
So Keianna, can you tell us what the Acadian-Micmac relations were like in Rivière du Nord-Est?
Of course. Well, we can't say for sure to what degree the Hache Gallants or the Rivière du Nord-Est community as a whole interacted with the Mi'kmaq. We do know that the two groups likely crossed paths. On a modern-day map, which was once this riverside settlement, is now home to Scotchford Reserve, a Mi'kmaq reserve on lands that correspond with traditional Mi'kmaq hunting and fishing grounds. Furthermore, just up the river from our Gallants, near modern-day Mount Stewart, was a common Mi'kmaq camping ground. We know that the two groups crossed paths. The Acadian presence on the marshlands bordering the river suggests that coexistence was occurring in some form.
Okay, so it's safe to say that Acadians in Rivière du Nord-Est were likely interacting with the local Mi'kmaqs.
Yes, I'd say so. We know that some Mi'kmaq aided in defense against the British by herding Acadian cattle away in 1758, as well as in the defense of Port LaJoie, a decade and a half earlier.
So Acadian-Mi'kmaq relations were positive too?
For sure. In fact, some historians and genealogists theorize that the Hache Gallants were of mixed indigenous French heritage, though they were not the only ones in Rivière du Nord-Est. The Martins, one of the first families to settle along the river, had both Acadian and Abenaki heritage. They would become kin to the Hache Gallants through one of the daughters of Marie Magdalene Hache. We can also theorize the degree of interaction between the two communities by examining existing parish records. Of course, the parish records of St. Louis du Nord-Est would disappear during the deportation. However, we might be able to gain some better understanding by examining some nearby parish records.
How so?
Well, Port LaJoie, where the Gallants originated, was known to be a meeting place for local indigenous peoples and French officials. Though historian Earl Lockerbie notes that nearby Havre St. Pierre offers a glimpse into religious life as a shared space for Acadian and Mi'kmaq residents. The first record, dated 1724, lists the baptism of a Mi'kmaq child, Magdalene Briand, and subsequent entries pertaining to Mi'kmaq people are sprinkled throughout the registers. Furthermore, they reveal French inhabitants as witness to church rites involving Indigenous people as godparents in the case of baptisms. Thus, we can see both the considerable effort made by French to spread Christianity to the local Indigenous communities, as well as a considerable amount of social interaction between the French residents and the local Mi'kmaq individuals. While documentation regarding Rivière du Nord-Est no longer exists, we can piece together a common theme when considering the island's other settlements in this period.
That's super interesting. So not only were Acadians and Indigenous peoples interacting with each other, but they may as well have been forming intimate and cross-cultural relationships.
Well, there is little documentation on this. I think that we can make some educated assumptions that relations were neither overly close or overwhelmingly tense, instead varying locally based on families and proximity. I did want to point out, though, Michael, that the relationship between the Gallant and the Mi'kmaq might not have been all friendly.
How so?
This information is found in local folklore, which we should treat with a little bit more skepticism about the historical accuracy of this source. In a travel log about Prince Edward Island, the author Helen Jean Champion, a lifelong resident of Prince Edward Island, actually wrote about the Gallant family in her book published in 1939. In this, she states, quote, "There are certainly plenty of Gallants here. As a matter of fact, the name Gallant has an unusual island significance. Originally, there were no Gallants here at all. Instead, there was a Francois Hache, who had a large family of children. He did some wonderful deeds, such as killing off a crowd of Indians. According to the legend we heard, he was henceforth dubbed Hache Gallant, the brave Hache." End quote. We know there was a Francois Hache, though he was the son of the first Hache Gallant, who moved to the island with his large family, Michael. Similarly, as you guys discovered last episode, there are reports of Michel Hache getting into a fight in his youth that resulted in the nickname Gallant, meaning brave, being added to his surname. However, that tale predates Michael's move to Ile St. in 1720. So, while Champion's story about the Gallants might not be entirely accurate, it can give us a glimpse into the stories about the localized relationships between the Acadian and the Mi'kmaq that survived over the centuries, at least specifically about the relationships between the Gallants and the Mi'kmaq. However, while this certainly could be the case, we do also have to acknowledge the time in which the story was written, as without written sources, there is a chance that Champion's tale could be an interpretation of the original story of our Michel Hache, shaped to mere prejudiced views of Indigenous peoples at the time.
That's really interesting, Keianna. Thanks for bringing that up. So on one hand, it is speculated that the Gallants were of mixed heritage, Acadian Indigenous heritage. But on the other, the Gallants were also remembered for their violence against Indigenous people.
That's the difficult part, Michael. But I think that we can definitively say from these sources is that the Gallant family has formed a rich history in not only Rivière du Nord-Est, but on all of Ile St.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing your research with us, Keianna.
Yes, thank you.
Anytime. Thank you guys for having me.
Well, we certainly learned a lot of this episode about what life was like for the population of Rivière du Nord-Est, as well as how the wider political climate shaped that life. Not only did the Hache Gallant end up in Rivière du Nord-Est as refugees, but so did many of their future neighbors.
It's unimaginable to think about, but we'll discover the unthinkable next episode, when the residents of Rivière du Nord-Est are faced with their worst fears, the arrival of the British on Ile St. Jean. Once again, I'm Kristina.
And I'm Michael, and we'll see you all in the next episode of
The Acadian Question.